Richard Harrington pulled his sleek black car through the wrought iron gates of Oakwood Cemetery. The autumn breeze scattered golden leaves across the perfectly maintained grounds. 5 years. It had been 5 years since he'd lost Michael, but the pain still felt fresh, like a wound that refused to heal properly. As the CEO of Horizon Technologies, Richard rarely had a moment to himself. His days were filled with board meetings, investment decisions, and press conferences. His nights were spent in luxury penthouses or first-class flights to the next business destination. The financial magazines called him the man with the golden touch. What they didn't mention was how empty his massive house felt, or how he sometimes woke up in the middle of the night reaching for his phone to call his son before remembering. Today, Richard had cleared his schedule. No assistants, no security detail, no drivers. Just a father visiting his son. He parked near the east entrance and grabbed the bouquet of white lilies from the passenger seat. Michael had always liked simple things, despite growing up with every luxury money could buy. The lilies reminded Richard of the wildflowers his son used to pick on their rare camping trips when Michael was younger. The walk to the family plot took about 5 minutes. Richard knew the path by heart now, past the old oak tree right at the angel statue, then straight ahead until he reached the black marble headstone with gold lettering. But today, something was different. From a distance, Richard could see a small figure kneeling at his son's grave. Richard slowed his pace, confused. They had no relatives in town anymore. His ex-wife had moved to Europe years ago, unable to bear the memories that haunted this city. Michael's college friends usually visited on his birthday, not the anniversary of the accident. As he got closer, Richard realized it was a boy, young, maybe 11 or 12, with messy brown hair and wearing a navy blue school uniform that had seen better days. The child was placing something on the grave. Flowers? No, not quite. They looked like wildflowers, probably picked from the meadow behind the cemetery. The boy was talking softly, his shoulders shaking slightly. He was crying. Richard stood frozen, unsure whether to approach or give the child privacy. Who was this boy? How did he know Michael? His son had volunteered at a youth center during his last year of high school, but that was years ago, and this boy would have been too young then. Curiosity finally won out. Richard cleared his throat gently as he approached. "Excuse me." The boy jumped to his feet, startled. He quickly wiped his eyes with his sleeve and took a step back. Up close, Richard could see the boy's face was pale and thin, with dark circles under his eyes that seemed out of place on someone so young. His school uniform was clean but worn at the edges, slightly too big for his frame. "I'm sorry," the boy stammered. "I didn't mean to. I can leave if you want." No, Richard said quickly, keeping his voice gentle. "It's all right. He gestured to the headstone. "Michael was my son." The boy's eyes widened. They were a striking shade of green that somehow seemed familiar to Richard, though he couldn't place why. "You're Michael's dad?" the boy asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Richard nodded, setting the lilies down beside the wildflowers. "I am. My name is Richard. And you are?" The boy hesitated, looking down at his scuffed shoes. "Jamie, my name is Jamie." "Nice to meet you, Jamie." Richard extended his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, the boy shook it. His hand was small, but his grip was surprisingly firm. "Did you know my son?" Jamie glanced at the headstone, then back at Richard. "Sort of," he said vaguely. "I come here sometimes to talk to him." Richard tried to hide his confusion. The math didn't add up. Michael had died at 19. This boy couldn't have been more than 6 or 7 at the time. "That's very kind of you," Richard said carefully. "May I ask why?" The wind picked up, rustling through the nearby trees. Jamie zipped up his jacket and shoved his hands in his pockets. "I just wanted to thank him," he said, "and tell him about my week." "Thank him?" Richard's confusion deepened. He noticed the boy was shivering slightly, though whether from the cold or emotion he couldn't tell. "Would you like to sit?" Richard gestured to a nearby bench. "You seem cold." Jamie looked hesitant but nodded. They walked to the bench in silence, sitting with a respectful distance between them. Richard had interviewed countless business rivals and negotiated billion-dollar deals, but somehow talking to the small boy felt more intimidating. "Those are nice flowers you brought," Richard said, nodding toward the wildflowers on the grave. Jamie's face brightened a little. "I found them by the creek behind my apartment. There's still some growing even though it's getting colder." He paused. "The red ones were my favorite. My mom says I used to try to eat them when I was little. Richard smiled despite himself. Michael used to collect leaves and rocks when he was young. Drove his mother crazy when she found them in the laundry. Really? Jamie looked interested. What else did he like? The question caught Richard off guard. When was the last time he'd talked about Michael with someone who actually wanted to hear the stories? His business associates avoided the topic, and his few friends seemed uncomfortable when Michael's name came up. He loved music, Richard said, memories washing over him. Played guitar. Not very well at first, but he practiced until his fingers bled. Stubborn kid, he smiled sadly. He loved the outdoors. Camping, hiking, swimming. He was studying environmental science in college. Jamie nodded, taking in every word. Was he nice? I bet he was nice. He was, Richard said, his throat tightening. Kinder than me, that's for sure. Always looking out for the underdog. Drove me crazy sometimes. He'd give away his lunch money, his clothes, anything to help someone else. Richard shook his head. I wanted him to be tougher for business. Now I wish I'd been more like him. They sat quietly for a moment. A groundskeeper drove by on a small utility cart, nodding respectfully in their direction before continuing on his rounds. Jamie, Richard said gently, I'm very touched that you visit my son, but I'm still curious about how you knew him. The boy's shoulders tensed. He kicked at a pebble on the ground, his expression suddenly guarded. It's complicated. Richard waited, but Jamie didn't elaborate. Instead, the boy glanced at his worn wristwatch and stood up abruptly. I should go. My mom will be worried. Of course, Richard said, standing as well. Do you need a ride home? No, thank you, Jamie said quickly. I'd take the bus. It's not far. He hesitated, then added, I come here every Tuesday after school. Around this time. Richard recognized an invitation when he heard one, even an indirect one. I see. Well, perhaps I'll see you next Tuesday then. Jamie nodded, relief crossing his face. Maybe. He turned to leave but paused after a few steps. Your son was a hero, Mr. Harrington. That's what my mom says. Before Richard could ask what he meant, Jamie was jogging toward the cemetery gates, his too big backpack bouncing against his thin frame. Richard stood watching until the boy disappeared from view. Then he turned back to his son's grave, mind racing with questions. What's going on, Michael? He whispered to the headstone. Who is this kid? Back in his car, Richard sat with the engine off, deep in thought. In his world of corporate takeovers and investment portfolios, mysteries were rare. Problems had solutions. Questions had answers. If you wanted information, you paid for it. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number. Dan, it's Richard Harrington. I need your services again. He paused. No, not corporate espionage this time. Something personal. I need information on a boy named Jamie, probably around 12 years old. Wears a navy blue school uniform. Richard provided what little information he had, which wasn't much. I know it's not a lot to go on, but that's why I pay you the big bucks, right? And Dan, discretion is essential. This is a child we're talking about. After ending the call, Richard sat for a few more minutes, staring at Michael's headstone in the distance. The white lilies and wildflowers stood out against the black marble. 5 years of grieving. 5 years of throwing himself into work to avoid the pain. 5 years of wondering what Michael might have become. And now this strange encounter with a boy who claimed some connection to his son. A connection important enough to bring him to this cemetery week after week. For the first time in years, Richard felt something besides grief and numbness. Curiosity. Maybe even a spark of hope. There was more to his son's story than he knew, and somehow, this boy Jamie held the key. As Richard finally started his car and drove away, he made a silent promise to Michael and to himself. He would return next Tuesday. And eventually he would uncover the truth that this young boy was hiding. The week crawled by for Richard. Between back-to-back meetings and conference calls, his mind kept drifting to the boy at the cemetery. Jamie. There was something about him, something in those green eyes that tugged at Richard's memory. By Friday, Richard was irritable enough that his executive assistant, Tina, finally spoke up. Something's bothering you, she said, setting down a stack of contracts on his desk. Not a question, but a statement. After 15 years working together, she could read his moods better than anyone. Richard sighed and leaned back in his leather chair. The floor-to-ceiling windows of his office showcased the city skyline, a view most would kill for. Today he barely noticed it. Just thinking about Michael, he said simply. Tina's expression softened. She was one of the few people who never changed the subject when he mentioned his son. The anniversary was this week, wasn't it? Richard nodded, then surprised himself by adding, I met someone at the cemetery. A young boy. He visits Michael's grave regularly, but I can't figure out why. A relative of one of Michael's friends, perhaps? No, Richard shook his head. He's too young. And something about the way he spoke. He said Michael was a hero. Tina raised an eyebrow but didn't push. Your investigator will find out, I'm sure. Richard's phone buzzed. Speaking of the devil, it was Dan. I should take this, he said, and Tina nodded, closing the door quietly behind her. Dan, tell me you have something. I do, but not everything. Dan's gruff voice came through the speaker. The boy's full name is James Wilson. He goes by Jamie, 12 years old, lives with his mother, Lisa Wilson, in the Riverside apartments on the east side. The east side, that was the working-class part of town, where Horizon Technologies had recently bought property for redevelopment. Nothing like the gated community where Richard's mansion stood. The mother works 2 jobs, Dan continued. Mornings at a bakery downtown, evenings waiting tables at the Olive Branch restaurant. The boy is enrolled at St. Francis Academy. St. Francis? Richard cut in. That's a private school, expensive. On scholarship, Dan clarified. Full ride. Kid's apparently some kind of math whiz. Richard processed this information. A single mother working 2 jobs to support her son, who attended a prestigious school on scholarship. But still no connection to Michael. What about medical records? Richard asked. He wasn't normally one to invade privacy, but his need to understand overrode his scruples. That's where I hit a wall, Dan admitted. Those are sealed tight, especially for minors. I'd need more time and questionable methods to access them. Richard frowned. No, let's not go there yet. What about social media? Friends? Any connection to my son or my family? Nothing obvious. The mother doesn't have much online presence. No Facebook and no Instagram, just a LinkedIn profile listing her jobs. The boy's too young for most platforms. What about school records? Any mention of Michael or connection to the hospital where he... Richard couldn't finish the sentence, not that I could find, but I did discover something interesting. Every year on the anniversary of your son's death, Jamie misses school. Every single year for the past 5 years. Richard fell silent, digesting this information. The timing couldn't be coincidental. Keep digging, he finally said. But carefully. They're not suspects, Dan. I just need to understand. After hanging up, Richard walked to the window. Below, the city hummed with life. People rushing to meetings, tourists taking photos, workers repairing roads. Normal life continuing, just as it had after Michael's death. The world didn't stop spinning just because your heart broke. Tuesday couldn't come fast enough. Richard arrived at the cemetery earlier than the previous week. He parked his car, a less flashy model this time, and walked to Michael's grave. The wildflowers Jamie had left were now wilted, but someone had arranged them in a small glass jar with water. The groundskeeper, perhaps. He sat on the bench and waited, rehearsing what he would say. How do you ask a child why he mourns your son without sounding accusatory? How do you probe for answers without scaring him away? At exactly 4:15, he spotted Jamie walking through the cemetery gates. The boy moved with purpose, knowing exactly where he was going. He carried his backpack in a small paper bag. When Jamie spotted Richard, he hesitated for just a moment before continuing to the grave. He didn't seem surprised to see him. Hello, Mr. Harrington, Jamie said quietly. Hello, Jamie, Richard replied, standing from the bench. Or should I say James Wilson? The boy's eyes widened slightly. You looked me up. It wasn't a question, and there was no point denying it. I did. I hope you're not upset. Jamie shrugged, kneeling to place fresh wildflowers by the headstone. My mom says rich people always want to know everything. Richard couldn't help but smile at the blunt assessment. Your mom sounds wise. She is, Jamie said proudly. She works really hard so I can go to a good school. He glanced up at Richard. Did you look her up too? I did, Richard admitted, seeing no point in lying. Lisa Wilson. Works at City Bakery and the Olive Branch. Jamie nodded, seemingly unbothered by this invasion of privacy. He opened the paper bag he'd brought and pulled out a chocolate chip cookie, breaking it in half. He placed one half at the base of the headstone. Michael likes cookies? Richard asked gently, sitting on the ground next to Jamie. his expensive suit pants touching the grass without concern. "Everyone likes cookies," Jamie replied with the simple logic of childhood. He offered the other half to Richard. "Want to share?" The gesture touched Richard unexpectedly. When was the last time someone had shared food with him without an agenda? In his world of business dinners and charity galas, every meal came with strings attached. "Thank you," he said, accepting the cookie half. They ate in companionable silence for a moment. "My mom says it's important to share things with people," Jamie said, brushing crumbs from his hands. "Even when you don't have much." Richard felt a twinge of shame. He had more money than he could spend in 10 lifetimes, yet he couldn't remember the last time he'd shared anything meaningful with anyone. "Your mom is right again," he said softly. "Jamie, can I ask you something?" The boy tensed slightly but nodded. "Why do you come here every week? How did you know my son?" Jamie picked at a loose thread on his uniform pants, not meeting Richard's eyes. "I didn't know him." "Not really." "Then why?" "Because he saved me," Jamie blurted out, his voice suddenly fierce. "And I never got to say thank you." Richard felt as if the ground had shifted beneath him. "Saved you? How?" Jamie took a deep breath, looking at the headstone rather than at Richard. 5 years ago, I got really sick. My heart wasn't working right. The doctor said I needed a new one or I would die." Richard's own heart seemed to stop. 5 years ago, the same time Michael had died in that car accident. "I was in the hospital for a long time," Jamie continued, "getting weaker every day. The doctors told my mom they weren't sure they could find a heart for me in time." He swallowed hard, and then they did. Richard couldn't speak, couldn't move. Somewhere in the back of his mind he knew what was coming, but he needed to hear Jamie say it. "It was your son's heart," Jamie said quietly. "After his accident, his heart came to me." The world around Richard seemed to fade away. The cemetery, the breeze, the distant sound of traffic. All he could focus on was this small boy sitting beside him, this boy who carried his son's heart. "How do you know it was Michael's?" Richard finally managed to ask, his voice hoarse. "They don't tell you who the donor is," Jamie explained. "That's the rules. But my mom wrote letters to thank the family and I drew pictures. We sent them through the hospital." He looked up at Richard. "Did you ever get them?" Richard shook his head numbly. After Michael's death, he'd cut himself off from everything. Changed his phone number, hired staff to sort his mail. Any communication from the hospital would have been filed away or discarded. "Then how did you find out it was Michael?" he asked. Jamie looked down again, suddenly interested in his shoelaces. "There was a nurse at my checkups. She was nice to me. When I got older, I kept asking about my donor. I wanted to know. She wasn't supposed to tell, but..." He shrugged. "She felt sorry for me, I guess. She just told me his first name and that his dad was a famous businessman." "And you figured out the rest," Richard concluded. Jamie nodded. "I looked up businessmen named Richard with sons named Michael and found a news article about the accident. It had a picture of the cemetery, so I came here." Richard was amazed at the boy's determination. "You did all that detective work by yourself?" A hint of pride crossed Jamie's face. "I'm good at research. My science teacher says I'm resourceful." "That you are," Richard agreed, his mind still reeling from the revelation. This boy, this stranger, was walking around with Michael's heart beating in his chest. The heart that Richard had felt as a tiny flutter when his ex-wife was pregnant. The heart he'd listened to through a stethoscope on Michael's first doctor visit. The heart that had stopped on a rainy night on a dark highway, and now it continued giving life to this child. "Are you mad?" Jamie asked, misinterpreting Richard's silence. "Mad? No," Richard assured him quickly. "Just overwhelmed. I had no idea." He looked at Jamie more carefully now, seeing him with new eyes. "Does your mother know you come here?" Jamie nodded. "She drives me sometimes when she's not working. She waits in the car." He hesitated. "She says it's important to be grateful. That's why I come every week, to say thank you." Richard sat in his car outside the Riverside apartments, gathering his courage. The building was clean, but showing its age. Peeling paint on the railings, a few missing roof tiles, window air conditioning units humming noisily. Nothing like the luxury high-rises his company developed. After learning that Jamie carried Michael's heart, Richard had asked to meet the boy's mother. Jamie had seemed uncertain but eventually agreed, scribbling his address and phone number on a scrap of paper. "We're in apartment 302. Mom works until 9 on Thursdays." It was now 7:30 p.m. on Thursday. Richard had left work early. shocking his executive team who couldn't remember the last time their boss had departed before sunset. He'd driven around the neighborhood for nearly an hour, delaying the inevitable. What would he say to this woman? Thank you for letting your son visit my son's grave. Or perhaps, I'm sorry I never answered your letters of gratitude for my son's heart. Nothing seemed adequate. A light rain began to fall. Richard finally stepped out of his car, grabbing the small gift basket he'd brought. Nothing flashy. He'd specifically asked his assistant to find something modest. It contained fresh fruit, a loaf of artisan bread, and a small box of specialty teas. Not too expensive, but quality items that might brighten someone's day. He took the stairs to the third floor as the elevator had an out-of-order sign taped to it. The hallway was narrow but clean, with welcome mats and small decorations outside some doors showing the residents took pride in their homes despite limited means. At apartment 302, Richard hesitated again before knocking softly. The door opened almost immediately, revealing Jamie in sweatpants and a faded blue t-shirt that said Math Olympics 2024 across the front. The boy's eyes widened in surprise. "Mr. Harrington, I didn't think you'd really come." Before Richard could respond, a woman's voice called from inside. "Jamie, who is it?" "It's Michael's dad," Jamie called back, and Richard heard something clatter to the floor. A moment later, Lisa Wilson appeared behind her son. She was petite with the same brown hair as Jamie, though hers was pulled back in a practical ponytail. She wore jeans and a simple green sweater, and despite looking exhausted, her eyes, the same striking green as her son's, were alert and wary. "Mr. Harrington," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "This is unexpected." "I apologize for not calling first," Richard said, suddenly feeling awkward despite being a man who regularly commanded rooms full of powerful executives. "Jamie and I discussed meeting, but we hadn't set a specific time." "We talked about it, Mom," Jamie confirmed. "At the cemetery. Remember?" Lisa's expression softened slightly. "I remember." She opened the door wider. "Please come in." "Our home is nothing fancy, but you're welcome." The apartment was small but immaculately kept. The living room flowed into a tiny kitchen, with two doors off to the side that Richard assumed led to bedrooms. Every inch of space was utilized efficiently. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with textbooks and library books. A small dining table served double duty as a desk with Jamie's schoolwork spread across it. "I brought this," Richard said awkwardly, holding out the gift basket. "Just a few things." Lisa hesitated before accepting it. "Thank you. That's very kind." She placed it on the kitchen counter. "Would you like some coffee? Or water?" "Coffee would be wonderful, thank you. I'll make it." Jamie volunteered, seemingly excited to have a guest. "I know how. Mom taught me." As Jamie busied himself in the kitchen, Lisa gestured for Richard to sit on the small sofa. She took the armchair across from him, her posture straight and dignified despite her obvious fatigue. "So," she said quietly, "you know about the transplant?" Richard nodded. "Jamie told me last week." "I had no idea." "We tried to reach out," Lisa said, a hint of reproach in her voice. "Through the hospital's donor program. They said the donor family didn't want contact." Richard ran a hand through his hair. "That wasn't. I never made that decision. After Michael died, I wasn't functioning well. My staff handled everything. I didn't even know he was an organ donor until—" He trailed off, the reality of it still sinking in. Lisa's expression softened. "I understand. Grief makes it hard to think straight. When Jamie was waiting for a heart, there were days I couldn't remember my own name. Here's the coffee," Jamie announced proudly, carrying two mugs carefully. He handed one to Richard and one to his mother. "I already had hot chocolate," he explained. "Thank you," Richard said, genuinely touched by the boy's eagerness to serve. He took a sip. It was strong and slightly bitter, but he smiled appreciatively. "Did you tell him about my checkups, Mom?" Jamie asked, sitting cross-legged on the floor between them. Lisa nodded. "Jamie has to go for regular checkups to make sure his body isn't rejecting the heart. He takes medication every day." She looked at Richard directly. "The doctors say he's doing exceptionally well." "Your son's heart is strong." Richard felt a lump in his throat. "Michael was always healthy, athletic. He played soccer in high school." Jamie's face lit up. "Really, I play soccer too. I'm not very good at running fast, but Coach says I have good strategy." "Michael was the same way," Richard said, smiling at the unexpected similarity. He wasn't the fastest, but he could read the field better than anyone. Do you have pictures? Jamie asked eagerly. Of Michael playing soccer? The question caught Richard off guard. Did he have pictures? He'd sealed away most of Michael's things after the funeral, unable to bear looking at them. I'm sure I do, he said thoughtfully. At home, in albums. And probably on my phone, too. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through his photo gallery, finding a folder he rarely opened labeled simply M. With slightly trembling fingers, he tapped it open and found a photo of Michael in his university soccer uniform, grinning widely after a game. His dark hair sweaty and his cheeks flushed with exertion. Here, Richard said, handing the phone to Jamie. This was from his freshman year of college. Jamie studied the photo intently, his fingers hovering over the screen as if afraid to touch it. He looks happy, he said finally. He was, Richard confirmed. Most of the time. Lisa watched her son looking at the photo, her expression unreadable. Jamie has always been curious about his donor. The doctors say that's normal. She hesitated. But I want you to know we never intended to intrude on your grief. When Jamie figured out the connection and started visiting the cemetery, I was concerned it might be inappropriate. It's not inappropriate, Richard assured her. It's comforting, actually, to know that Michael's heart is still out there, still beating. His voice cracked slightly on the last word. Jamie handed the phone back carefully. Sometimes I talk to him, he admitted shyly. To Michael. Not out loud or anything weird. Just in my head sometimes. When I'm scared or having a bad day. Is that okay? Richard felt tears pressing behind his eyes. That's more than okay, Jamie. An awkward silence fell, broken only by the ticking of a wall clock and the distant sound of a television from a neighboring apartment. May I ask, Richard finally said, about Jamie's condition? What caused the heart problem? Lisa's hand moved unconsciously to her son's shoulder. He was born with a congenital heart defect. The doctors thought it could be managed with medication and surgeries, but when he was 7, his heart began to fail rapidly. He was on the transplant list for 8 months. 8 months of waiting, hoping for a miracle while knowing that miracle would come from another family's tragedy. Richard couldn't imagine the strain. The medical bills must have been substantial, he said carefully. Lisa's chin lifted slightly. Insurance covered most of it. And there are programs for transplant patients. We manage. The pride in her voice was unmistakable. This was a woman who had faced impossible odds to save her son and continued to work multiple jobs to give him a good life. Richard, who had thrown money at every problem since building his fortune, felt humbled. I don't mean to pry, he said gently. It's just that, well, Michael's heart is in Jamie. That creates a connection between us, doesn't it? I'd like to help if you'd allow it. Lisa's expression turned guarded. We don't need charity, Mr. Harrington. Not charity, Richard corrected quickly. An investment, maybe. In Jamie's future. A scholarship fund for college. Or I could make some calls about medical research for better anti-rejection medications. Jamie looked up at his mother hopefully, but she shook her head. We've made it this far on our own, she said firmly. Richard respected her pride, even as he saw the weariness in the lines around her eyes. This wasn't the time to push, I understand, he said, setting down his coffee mug. But may I at least stay in touch? Perhaps Jamie could visit me sometimes and I could tell him more about Michael. If that's something he'd want. Jamie nodded eagerly. Could I, Mom, please? Lisa studied Richard's face as if searching for hidden motives. Whatever she saw must have satisfied her because she nodded slowly. We could start with dinner, she suggested. Next week when I have a night off. You could come back here, or she trailed off, clearly uncomfortable with the idea of suggesting they eat at whatever luxury restaurant a billionaire might prefer. I know a great pizza place near the park, Richard suggested, remembering Michael's favorite childhood restaurant. Casual. The best garlic knots in the city. Michael loved them. Jamie's eyes lit up. I love garlic knots too. For the first time, Lisa smiled fully. Then it settled. Pizza next week. As Richard prepared to leave, Jamie surprised him by giving him a quick, impulsive hug. The boy's thin arms wrapped around his waist briefly before he stepped back, suddenly shy again. Thanks for coming, Jamie said, and for not being mad about me visiting the cemetery. Thank you for visiting him, Richard replied honestly. I think he'd like knowing someone was bringing him cookies and wildflowers. Walking back to his car in the light rain, Richard felt lighter than he had in years. The pain of losing Michael would never disappear completely, but for the first time, he felt something new growing alongside the grief. Hope. Over the next few months, Richard found himself doing something he hadn't done in years, rearranging his schedule for someone else. Wednesday evenings became sacred. No meetings, no conference calls, no business dinners. That was pizza night with Jamie and Lisa. It had started with one dinner at Romano's, the little pizza place Michael had loved as a child. The evening had been slightly awkward at first. Lisa still cautious, Richard still unsure of his place in their lives. But Jamie's enthusiasm had bridged the gap, his questions about Michael creating a natural flow of conversation. Did Michael like school? Was he good at math too? Did he have a dog growing up? Each question unlocked memories Richard had kept buried, painful at first to recall but gradually becoming a source of bittersweet joy. He found himself laughing as he told Jamie about the time 13-year-old Michael had tried to sneak a stray puppy into their house, hiding it in his jacket until the pup had peed all over the imported Italian sofa. "Did you let him keep it?" Jamie had asked, eyes wide. "I was furious about the sofa," Richard admitted. "But the next day, we went to the animal shelter and adopted a proper dog. A golden retriever named Buck. What happened to Buck?" Jamie asked. Richard's smile had faded. "He lives with my ex-wife now in France. After Michael died, I couldn't—" He hadn't finished the sentence, but Jamie had nodded with a wisdom beyond his years. That first dinner had led to another, and then another. Soon it became their weekly tradition. Richard insisted on paying, and after initial resistance, Lisa had accepted with grace. In return, she always brought something homemade for dessert. Cookies or brownies that Jamie proudly announced his mom had taught him to help bake. Today was different, though. Richard sat in the waiting room of City Memorial Hospital, nervously checking his watch. It was Jamie's 6-month checkup with the transplant team. Lisa had mentioned it casually during their last dinner, and Richard had immediately asked if he could come along. "You don't have to," Lisa had said, surprised. "I want to," Richard had insisted, "if that's okay with both of you." Jamie had nodded eagerly, and after a moment's hesitation, Lisa had agreed. Now, as Richard sat surrounded by other anxious families in the waiting room, he questioned his decision. What right did he have to be here? He wasn't family. He was just, what? A friend, a benefactor? The father of Jamie's heart donor? Whatever his role, he was invested now. In the months since meeting Jamie, Richard had done extensive research on pediatric heart transplants. He'd learned about immunosuppressant medications, rejection signs, long-term outcomes. He'd made discreet donations to the hospital's transplant research program. He'd even started taking better care of his own health, cutting back on the 18-hour workdays and excessive coffee. "Mr. Harrington?" Richard looked up to see Lisa standing in the doorway. He stood quickly, searching her face for any sign of bad news. "Everything's fine," she assured him, noting his concern. "The doctor just wants to discuss some test results." Jamie asked if you could come in too. Relief washed over him as he followed Lisa down the hallway to the examination room. Jamie sat on the edge of an exam table, swinging his legs. He wore a hospital gown, but had his regular clothes folded neatly beside him. He brightened when he saw Richard. "They did an echo," he announced. "I got to see Michael's heart on the screen. It looks awesome." Richard smiled at Jamie's enthusiasm before turning his attention to the doctor, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a tablet in her hands. "Dr. Chen, this is Richard Harrington," Lisa introduced. "He's a friend of the family." The doctor nodded professionally. "Nice to meet you, Mr. Harrington. Jamie mentioned you'd be joining us." She turned back to Lisa. "As I was saying, Jamie's echocardiogram looks excellent. The heart function is strong, and there are no signs of rejection." Richard felt his own heart lift at the news. "His blood work shows the medication levels are appropriate," Dr. Chen continued. "But I am a bit concerned about his activity level." She looked at Jamie directly. "Have you been pushing yourself too hard at soccer practice?" Jamie looked down at his feet. "Maybe a little. We have a tournament coming up." Lisa frowned. "You didn't tell me you were having trouble at practice." "I didn't want you to make me quit the team," Jamie mumbled. "I'm finally getting good." Dr. Chen's expression was gentle but firm. "Nobody's saying you need to quit, Jamie. But remember what we discussed about listening to your body? If you're feeling more tired than usual or having trouble catching your breath, That's your body telling you to slow down. Richard listened intently, making mental notes. Maybe he could help somehow. A personal trainer who specialized in working with transplant patients. Or perhaps the summer program, he said suddenly, causing everyone to look at him. Sorry, I just remembered. My company sponsors a youth soccer camp each summer. It's run by professional coaches who work with kids of all ability levels. They could create a specialized training program for Jamie to help build his stamina safely. Jamie's eyes lit up. Really, with real pro coaches? Dr. Chen looked intrigued. That could be beneficial, actually. Structured exercise with proper monitoring would be ideal. She turned to Lisa. What do you think, Mom? Lisa seemed torn. Richard knew she was still uncomfortable accepting help, still fiercely independent despite their growing friendship. The camp is free for all participants, Richard added quickly. It's part of our community outreach program. This wasn't strictly true. The camp had a tuition fee, though there were scholarships available. But he could easily add Jamie's name to the scholarship list. Can I, Mom? Please, Jamie pleaded. After a moment, Lisa nodded. We can look into it, she agreed, giving Richard a look that said they'd discuss the details later. Dr. Chen continued reviewing Jamie's test results, explaining some minor adjustments to his medication schedule. Richard listened attentively, asking thoughtful questions that impressed both the doctor and Lisa. You've done your homework, Dr. Chen commented. Richard nodded. I like to be informed. After the appointment, the three of them walked through the hospital parking lot together. The spring weather was turning warmer, trees budding with new leaves, a metaphor for new beginnings that wasn't lost on Richard. Ice cream, he suggested, noting how Jamie still seemed a bit subdued after the doctor's cautions about overdoing it at soccer. Jamie looked to his mother for permission, and Lisa checked her watch. I suppose we have time before my shift, she agreed, but just a small one. We don't want to spoil dinner. They drove separately to a nearby ice cream shop, Lisa and Jamie in her modest sedan, Richard in his luxury car. As he watched them walk into the shop ahead of him, Richard was struck by how natural it felt to be spending time with them. These Wednesday outings had become the highlight of his week, something he looked forward to more than any business success. Inside, Jamie deliberated seriously over the flavor options before selecting mint chocolate chip. Lisa chose vanilla, and Richard went with strawberry, Michael's favorite. They sat at a small table near the window, Jamie chattering about his upcoming science project while Lisa occasionally reminded him not to talk with his mouth full. Richard watched them, a strange feeling spreading through his chest. It took him a moment to identify it: contentment. For the first time in 5 years, he felt truly content. I have an idea, he said suddenly. The company has a box at the baseball stadium. Would you two like to go to a game this weekend? Saturday afternoon? Jamie nearly knocked over his ice cream in excitement. The Thunderbolts? For real? For real, Richard confirmed, smiling at the boys' enthusiasm. And they're playing the Rockets. Should be a good game. Lisa hesitated. That's very generous, but I'm scheduled to work on Saturday. Could you swap shifts with someone? Richard suggested. I don't mean to interfere with your work, but he trailed off, not wanting to push. Lisa studied his face for a moment. I could ask Patty to cover for me, she said finally. She owes me a favor. Yes. Jamie pumped his fist in the air. But, Lisa added firmly, this can't become a regular thing. Your generosity is appreciated, Richard, but we need to maintain our independence. Richard nodded, understanding her concern. In his world, money was used to solve problems, secure favors, and influence outcomes. For Lisa, accepting too much felt like compromising her hard-won self-sufficiency. I respect that, he said sincerely, but please know that spending time with you both isn't charity from my perspective. He searched for the right words. It's something I need. More than either of you need baseball tickets or soccer camps. Lisa's expression softened. Michael would be proud of you, you know, for opening your heart again. Richard hadn't thought of it that way. Had he opened his heart? The walls he'd built after Michael's death had seemed impenetrable. Yet somehow this boy and his mother had found a way through. Later that evening, after dropping Jamie and Lisa at their apartment, Richard drove to the cemetery. He hadn't visited Michael's grave since meeting Jamie, feeling somehow that he didn't need the stone marker anymore to connect with his son's memory. But tonight, as the setting sun cast long shadows across the grounds, he felt drawn there. The grave looked different. Someone had planted small flowering bushes on either side of the headstone. Jamie's doing, no doubt. Richard sat on the familiar bench and looked at his son's name engraved in marble. "I met him," he said softly. "The boy who has your heart. His name is Jamie." He smiled slightly. "He reminds me of you sometimes. Not in looks, but in spirit. Determined, kind, smarter than he lets on." A gentle breeze rustled the new flowers, and Richard continued talking, telling Michael about Jamie's soccer ambitions and Lisa's incredible strength. He spoke until the sky darkened and the first stars appeared. For the first time since the accident, Richard left the cemetery feeling lighter, not heavier. Something was shifting inside him. The grief wasn't gone, but it was making room for something new, something that felt remarkably like family. 1 year had passed since Richard first spotted Jamie at Michael's grave. The seasons had come full circle, and autumn leaves once again carpeted the cemetery grounds. But this time, as Richard walked the familiar path to his son's resting place, he wasn't alone. "Race you to the angel statue," Jamie called, taking off down the path with a burst of energy. His stamina had improved dramatically over the past year, thanks to the specialized training program Richard had arranged and the careful monitoring of his medical team. "No fair. You got a head start," Richard called back, jogging after the boy. At 53, he wasn't exactly built for sprinting, but the regular basketball games and weekend hikes with Jamie had improved his own fitness considerably. Lisa walked beside him at a more reasonable pace, smiling at their antics. "Sometimes I think I'm raising 2 children instead of 1, she teased. Richard laughed, not minding the comparison. "Jamie keeps me young," he admitted, "and he's a much better influence on my health than my board of directors." Indeed, the changes in Richard's life over the past year had raised eyebrows in the business world. The notorious workaholic now left the office by 5 p.m. on Wednesdays without fail. He'd delegated more responsibilities to his executive team. He'd even taken a 2-week vacation, his first in over a decade, to take Jamie and Lisa to the Grand Canyon, a trip that had been on Michael's bucket list. The business magazines had speculated about health problems or a secret romance. None had guessed the truth, that Richard Harrington, feared corporate raider and ruthless negotiator, had effectively become a part-time dad to a 12-year-old transplant recipient. As they approached Michael's grave, Jamie slowed, his expression becoming more solemn. The wildflowers he'd planted had flourished, creating a colorful border around the headstone. Together, the 3 of them stood quietly, paying their respects. "I think he would have liked today," Jamie said finally, placing a small stone on top of the headstone, a tradition he'd read about and adopted over the past year. "I think so too," Richard agreed, his throat tight with emotion. They had come to the cemetery straight from the hospital, where Dr. Chen had delivered wonderful news. Jamie's latest biopsy showed no signs of rejection. The heart, Michael's heart, was working perfectly, fully integrated into Jamie's body as if it had always belonged there. "Should we tell him about the foundation?" Jamie asked, looking up at Richard with excitement. Richard nodded, smiling. "Go ahead. It was your idea, after all." Jamie turned back to the headstone. "We started a foundation," he announced proudly. "The Michael Harrington Heart-to-Heart Foundation. It's going to help kids like me who need new hearts, and their families too." The foundation had been Jamie's brainchild, proposed during one of their Wednesday pizza dinners. Richard had been discussing a charitable donation to the hospital's transplant unit when Jamie had interrupted with unexpected passion. "That's good, but what about the other stuff?" he'd asked. "Like Mom had to take time off work when I was sick and we almost lost our apartment. And some kids at the hospital, their parents live really far away and can't visit much because hotels are expensive." The comment had stopped Richard in his tracks. In all his philanthropic efforts, he'd focused on medical research and equipment, the tangible aspects of treatment. He hadn't considered the practical challenges families faced: lost wages, housing insecurity, transportation costs, childcare for siblings. The next day, he'd started the paperwork for the foundation, with a mission crafted largely by Jamie to support the families of pediatric transplant patients by addressing their practical needs. Lisa had initially hesitated to get involved, but eventually agreed to serve on the board of directors. bringing her first-hand experience as a working single mother of a transplant recipient. The Foundation's first project is already happening, Lisa added, addressing the headstone as naturally as Jamie did. We're renovating an old building near the hospital to create affordable housing for families during long-term treatments. Richard listened to them talk to Michael, marveling at how this shared ritual no longer seemed strange to him. In fact, it felt right, a way of keeping Michael's memory alive while acknowledging the new connections his death had ultimately created. After their cemetery visit, they drove to Richard's house for dinner. In the past year, Jamie and Lisa had become regular visitors to the mansion Richard had once rattled around in alone. Lisa had initially been overwhelmed by the grandeur, but had gradually grown comfortable enough to scold Richard about his empty refrigerator and show him how to properly sort laundry. "I made dessert,"
Jamie announced as they entered the kitchen.
He ran to the refrigerator and pulled out a somewhat lopsided chocolate cake. "Mom helped a little, but I did most of it." "It looks delicious," Richard said sincerely. "What's the occasion?" Jamie and Lisa exchanged a look, and Richard sensed something important was coming. "We wanted to talk to you about something," Lisa said, her voice carefully neutral, "about the apartment building renovation near your office." Richard nodded, confused by her serious tone. His company was converting an old warehouse into modern apartments, and he'd mentioned it to Lisa a few weeks ago. "What about it?" "Jamie and I went to look at the model units last weekend. They're beautiful." "Thank you," Richard said, still not understanding. "But why? We want to buy one," Jamie blurted out, unable to contain himself any longer. "Mom's been saving up for a down payment and everything." Richard looked between them in surprise. Lisa's cheeks were flushed with a mixture of pride and embarrassment. "I should have discussed this with you privately first," she said. "But yes, we're interested in one of the smaller units. My new job at the hospital administration office pays better, and with the promotion they've promised for next year, I think we can manage the payments." In the past year, Richard had helped Lisa secure a position in the hospital's administrative office, utilizing her organizational skills and first-hand knowledge of the patient experience. He'd been careful to merely make the introduction, allowing Lisa to earn the position on her own merits. "You want to move closer to the office?" Richard asked, trying to process this unexpected development. "Closer to you," Jamie corrected, then looked to his mother uncertainly. "Right, Mom?" Lisa nodded, her usual self-assurance faltering slightly. "We've been thinking about it for a while. The drive across town for our Wednesday dinners is getting tiresome, and Jamie's new school would be closer to that neighborhood too." "My new school?" Richard echoed, feeling increasingly as if he'd walked into the middle of a conversation. Lisa took a deep breath. "Westlake Prep has offered Jamie a full academic scholarship for next year. Their math and science program is exactly what he needs, but the commute from our current apartment would be over an hour each way. Westlake is only 10 minutes from your house," Jamie added helpfully. "And from the new apartments." Richard sat down at the kitchen island, trying to absorb the implications of what they were saying. Westlake Prep was one of the most prestigious schools in the city, and happened to be Michael's alma mater. "And the apartment building, are you sure about this?" he asked Lisa quietly. "Moving across town is a big decision." "We're sure," Lisa said firmly. "It's time for a change. Jamie needs the academic opportunities. I like my new job, and—" She hesitated, then added softly, "We both value being closer to you." Richard felt a rush of emotion. For so long after Michael's death, he'd existed in isolation, his massive wealth creating a barrier between himself and authentic human connection. Now, against all odds, he'd found a new kind of family, one formed not by blood but by something equally powerful: Michael's final gift. "I think it's a wonderful idea," he said finally. "But I have a counterproposal." Lisa's eyebrows rose warily. "Richard," he held up a hand. "Hear me out. That house in Pine Hills that we looked at last month, the one with the big backyard and the tree swing. It has 3 bedrooms, a reasonable mortgage, and it's halfway between Westlake and the hospital." Jamie's eyes widened as he caught on. "You mean—" "I mean," Richard continued carefully, looking directly at Lisa, "that maybe it's time we talked about making this arrangement more permanent. Not just Wednesday dinners and weekend outings, but a real family, the 3 of us." Lisa's expression was unreadable. "Are you proposing what I think you're proposing?" Richard stood and took her hands in his. When had these feelings developed? He couldn't pinpoint the exact moment. Somewhere between her fierce protection of Jamie's independence and her gentle encouragement of Richard's healing, he'd fallen in love with Lisa Wilson. "I'm proposing everything," he said simply. "Marriage, if you'll have me. A home together. A future where we honor Michael's memory by living fully, the way he would have wanted." Jamie was practically vibrating with excitement, but he remained quiet, understanding that this moment belonged to the adults. Lisa's eyes shimmered with tears. "You know I don't care about your money, right?" "That's not why." "I know," Richard assured her. "Your independence is one of the many things I love about you." She smiled then, a full, radiant smile that transformed her face. "Well, in that case, I think we should discuss this proposal over a slice of Jamie's cake." It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no either. It was a beginning. Later that evening, after Jamie had gone to bed in the room that had gradually accumulated his belongings over months of sleepovers, Richard and Lisa sat on the patio, watching the stars appear one by one. "I never expected any of this," Lisa admitted, her head resting against Richard's shoulder. "When Jamie first discovered Michael's identity and started visiting the cemetery, I was worried it would only bring more pain, to him and to you. Instead, it brought healing," Richard said softly. "For all of us. 5 years ago, he'd lost his son and thought his capacity for joy had died with him. He'd thrown himself into making more money, building bigger buildings, acquiring more companies, none of which had filled the void in his heart. And then he'd spotted a young boy crying at his son's grave, and everything had changed. Through Jamie, a piece of Michael lived on, and through that connection, Richard had found his way back to life, back to love, back to family. Some might call it a miracle. Richard simply called it Michael's final, most precious gift. As if reading his thoughts, Lisa reached for his hand. "It's like the universe found a way to mend two broken families by joining them together." "Heart to heart," Richard whispered, echoing the name of the foundation that would be their shared legacy. Above them, a shooting star streaked across the night sky, brief, brilliant, and beautiful. "Just like life itself,"